In about 5,900 BC, Malta was inhabited by a farming community that came from Sicily. The farmers brought with them not only grain seeds, but also cattle and other domestic animals. The inhabitants, their young children and animals, all adding to nature's original soundscape. It was during this time that the temple builders became aware of the ringing bell-like qualities of the harder Maltese limestone. They heard the echoes and vibrations of resonant stones and spaces. We can attempt to visualize the sounds around and inside the temples and hypogeums. Chanting and dancing was enriched by pounding mortars, scraping bones, blowing of bull horns and conches.
The exhibition, Music in Malta from Prehistory to Vinyl, started as an idea many years earlier. I was brought up in music all my life. When I was playing things like Hungarian rhapsodies and Spanish dances, and somewhere along the line the thought came to me that, what about Maltese? You don't see anything Maltese, you don't hear anything Maltese. So that is a thought that stayed with me, and eventually that's what got me into research.
Fundamentally, music is part of our lives. Nowadays, more than ever, we're all stuck with headphones in our ears. We have music at the click of a button. But it is also important to realize that music does not exist in a vacuum. All the music that we have had a social function. It wasn't just one person just listening in isolation. And it is important because it is part of a community narrative, it's part of a national narrative.
What actually makes us Maltese? What is different about us? What are we different to our neighboring countries? What makes us special? And I think part of that has come out in this Fondazzjoni Patrimonju Malti exhibition.
We worked for almost 3 years on these exhibitions because initially we go to various people's houses to see what's available, and then once we find that there are enough elements within the private collection and national collection to create an exhibition, then we start working on the story and also the narrative.
This Music in Malta exhibition was one of the most important exhibitions to happen in Malta in recent years. To date, I don't think anyone has ever attempted such a broad approach to music in Malta.
We had never seen so many instruments in one area, contained in one area. This is something that's never been seen before, so this was something very, very special. But apart from that, we also had audio throughout the exhibition, which was also a first, where you could hear the sound of instruments and you could also hear the narration.
You were given a pair of headphones at the beginning, and you literally let yourself go into the different rooms, and you did not have to press any buttons. Everything worked with a triggering system, and you literally just walked and listened.
Musical instruments alone don't produce sound unless we play them. So the idea behind this exhibition was that we should also have concerts to go with it in order to hear the sound of some of those instruments which we were displaying.
I think it was very important for people who live in Malta and go to, and even for foreigners, to have experienced this exhibition in such a particular manner.
The history of sound in Malta continues through the island's historical developments, challenges, and opportunities. The colonizations and the commercial traffic taking place led to the sharing of musical knowledge, musical artifacts, and instruments in the Mediterranean. The 2nd century tombstone of the lyre player in Roman Malta encapsulates this cultural fusion.
Now, this tombstone, to me, was one of the most special works that we could exhibit. It weighed just under a ton. The instrument is actually depicted on his tombstone, the lira, and there's also the pick with which he played the instrument. And on the left, you can see the comedy masks.
The large decorated tombstone is a firm confirmation of the respect that there was for the musical profession, and more specifically, for this young Aelius Hemelaos, who died at the age of 25. The spread of Christianity carried with it the sacred songs that were so central to Christian worship. These songs developed into unaccompanied vocal and at times mystical chant that we refer to as plain chant, or imprecisely, Gregorian chant.
Santa Caterina was involved as part of the Music in Malta project to put up a performance of music from Renaissance and early Baroque Malta. Most of the repertoire we looked at was sacred music, but not just, and our aim was to give a broad picture of music in Malta in this very turbulent and interesting period.
The chants, or sacred songs, were laboriously handwritten on parchment with musical notation varying from region to region. The successful performance of a sacred song depended not only on its musical notations, but also on the ability of the singers to interpret this notation. In order to facilitate this process, the palm of the hand technique was used from medieval times to help the choristers sing any music set before them and learn the 6-note scales and intervals.
After we get the foundation of Valletta, the number of organs in Malta starts to increase exponentially.
Over time, sacred worship was accompanied by musical instruments, the main one being the organ, though other musical instruments were introduced mostly on Sundays and feast days. Other instruments that came to be largely associated with Christianity and calling the faithful to prayer were bells. They did, however, exist much earlier and were considered to have exorcistic and protective powers, dispelling all evil and calamities. Indeed, one of the Gozo Cathedral bells, dating back to 1639, is incised with the words "Daimones expello tempestates quae sereno," which means, "I expel demons and I calm tempests." From medieval times, however, during Holy Week, bells were replaced by the chutlaita, a wooden clapper or ratchet considered to represent Christ, his cross, and his suffering. Larger instruments were hung in the belfries, whilst smaller, Handheld ones were used inside the churches. This custom continues to take place in some of Malta's churches today. Sacred music flourished in Malta. By the very early 17th century, music composed by leading composers of the day was part of the cathedral's repertoire. However, by the mid-17th century, we also find Maltese composers producing work of the highest caliber. Francesco Azzopardi, born in 1748, achieved this through his music treatise Il Musico Pratico. This was the earliest treatise on music ever published by a Maltese composer. Another renowned composer, Niccolò Isuart, achieved his fame in Paris. He was born in Malta in 1773 and followed music studies in France and Naples. Niccolò de Malte, as he came to be known, settled in Paris, where he earned great repute in the opera comique, composing throughout his lifetime no less than 43 operas. In Malta, documents show that families of lutes, as well as guitars, were being constructed locally in the latter years of the 16th century.
Now, this is when we met Dr. George de Bono, who was very willing to lend us his instruments, which he made himself. Again, very interesting, because you find a family, for example, the Tonna family in Valletta, who was making double basses for several centuries. This is one of the things that came out through the research in the exhibition, to discover the Tonna family and discover several double basses which were actually on the island.
Around the Mediterranean, we therefore find several instruments built from materials common to the area, such as the arundo donax, also known as the Maltese asap, or reed plant in English. Stone and clay were used to make whistles, whereas animal skin was used to make friction drums, tambourines, and bagpipes.
The first time I met Tony Kakia, that's what I searched for him under his name, Tony Kakia. Nobody knew him. The minute I asked for Ilham Maroon, then I found him.
He was the last representative of the bagpipe playing tradition, which was always accompanied by a tambourine. You always had this bagpipe and tambourine tradition, which he calls zap and tambour. This form of an animated dance which kept the rhythm and the flow as he rhythmically accompanied the tunes of the bagpipe, to which Hammarum would sway to.
I learned a lot from him. He showed me everything step by step, how to make it, how to obtain the skin, how to skin it, how to actually cure it and preserve it.
Those same horns and those same skins you can't even get now because life is regulated. So regulated that you cannot get to these materials anymore. So there's a social context, there's this new context where now it's probably illegal to make a za.
I met Tony Kakia several times and we discussed making the za. We made the za together. So the exhibited bagpipe was actually made by us together. This is a very unique Maltese instrument, which we should be very proud of.
With the movement of people, instruments were shared between different cultures and religions. The lute, for instance, also known as the oud or oud, migrated from the Arab world into medieval Europe, undergoing various modifications.
Instruments over time accumulate like patina. To a musician, they become more and more loved because the sound that they produce as you endear this instrument and hold it every day, the wood gets thinner and finer and it resonates better with you, you know? So this is the amazing thing about instruments. Instruments, therefore, are very beautiful things. They tell a bit about history, they tell a bit about the social context in which they were used. They tell a bit about the person who used it and the music that was played in it.
Today, local folk singers sing to the accompaniment of guitars that are usually built in Malta.
At the Mdina Ditch, we had a concert of a celebration of world music, and we had two bands, one which was from southern Italy, Mascaramini, and Aiwa, which is a band that some of its members originate from northern African regions. And I was particularly interested in bringing Aiwa over to Malta, just because some of the instruments that they were using were exhibited in the exhibition itself. And also because there's a very particular treatment to the traditional singing, which is blended within a more contemporary setting.
One of the sections of the exhibition that focused on Maltese folk instruments and the Maltese folk singing, Ana.
Ana, coming from Arabic tghanni, to chant, actually rather than to sing, is a chant, is a form of chant, is a very strong linguistic tradition based on an octosyllabic rhyme.
This heritage we've got of Maltese folk singing is something very special and unique.
Ana challenges us in many ways. It challenges our views on music making and what does that mean. We have been too conditioned by this Anglo-Saxon Victorian approach to music, where you go to a theatre, go to a concert hall, you sit down, you listen almost religiously, and you clap politely at the end, and that's it. That was not the story of music making in Malta right up until the late 19th, early 20th century. The theatre was a very sort of riotous affair. You went there for the social aspect of it. many people would be horrified to know what actually went on in theatres. I mean, people had food, smoked, played cards. That was, pretty much part of the experience.
The traditional music culture, however, began to change when Malta became a British colony in 1814. Large regimental bands started performing regularly on the islands. Those who joined the militia band were taught to read music and to play brass instruments, as well as to perform in a uniformed marching group. The influence of all these bands was so great that between the mid-19th century and the early 20th century, military-style bands sprouted in most of the towns and villages of Malta and Gozo. There is now no Maltese festa without the presence of one or more of these uniformed bands, creating the festive Mediterranean atmosphere. Sound was totally revolutionized by Thomas Edison's invention of the phonograph in 1877. This method of mechanically recording and reproducing sound was modified, improved, and perfected over the following years by different inventors.
Just as the world was being fascinated by this new, very new technology of recording human voices onto a disc, Malta also took part.
When in the early 20th century, Maltese musicians started recording, they actually went abroad to record, to Italy or to Tunis, and they also gathered an international audience. Maltese music could now be listened to pretty much anywhere.
Each format is important because it guarantees the continuity of memory to the next generation. I think it's a great bonus to have actually possibility to listen to the Maltese musicians in a studio in Milan or in Tunis or in Valletta in those days live, because you really get this time and space which they were in, which is then played back to you 8 years later, which I find very fascinating.
Look, Pinky, make a record of your voice for me. Doesn't cost very much.
We haven't got a gramophone.
If ever you're away, I can borrow one, and then I can hear your voice.
All right. You asked me to make a record of my voice. Well, here it is. What you want me to say is I love you. Here's the truth. I hate you, you loose.
The beautiful thing about this exhibition is that it's not the end of a journey. On the contrary, I feel very much it's the start of a journey, pushing us to reevaluate a lot of what we know about music in Malta.
The reason, in fact, that's why we're having this documentary this time, is that because we really want to capture the essence of the exhibition, because the sad thing is that these exhibitions last for about 8 weeks and then they're dismantled and they're gone forever.
Now, this exhibition took many years in the making. What I would like to see is something more permanent, that we have a permanent place where we can exhibit instruments and also perform. This is something which is required on the island, and this exhibition has proved to me that it is possible. And I do hope that we will have something more permanent.
Maltin, għatma samaħ tajjeb l-għana. Jekk kalla tuk il-grazzja li inti għandek il-pożija ġafik, għandek id-dakkara l-għana bil-pożija wkoll. Bas jena għalija l-għana u l-pożija u maħwa.
Fate larghi, signori, kulħadd postu, attenzjoni. Fermi! Avanti! النساء جوا! طيب! نفوتوا! Fermi! Avanti! النساء بصوا! Letto l'imcata! Avanti! Cacciata! Tazzagarella! Palanter! Avanti! Avanti! Fermi! Chiamare a contenti!